The desert wind carried death that morning, whipping sand across the barren landscape of Afghanistan like nature itself was trying to erase what was about to happen. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez had felt it the moment he stepped off the helicopter. That electric tension in the air that every seasoned soldier knows means trouble is coming. Rodriguez wasn't just any soldier. At 34, he had survived more combat deployments than most men twice his age would ever see. His weathered face told stories of firefights in Iraq, rescue missions in Syria, and countless operations that would never make it into official records. The younger SEALs called him the Ghost because of his uncanny ability to appear and disappear in hostile territory without a trace. But to his team, he was simply Marcus, the man who always brought everyone home. The mission briefing had been straightforward enough. Intelligence indicated that a high-value Taliban commander was hiding in a remote compound 15 miles northeast of their forward operating base. The target had been responsible for coordinating attacks that had killed dozens of coalition forces over the past 6 months. Command wanted him alive if possible. But dead would work just fine too. Rodriguez led a team of 8 elite Navy SEALs, each handpicked for their expertise. There was Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Thompson, barely 26 but already a legend with a sniper rifle. Petty Officer Carlos Mendez could disarm any explosive device ever made, and his steady hands had saved more lives than anyone could count. The team was completed by 6 other warriors, each carrying their own specialties and their own reasons for being there. As their convoy of armored vehicles moved through the rocky terrain, Rodriguez studied the satellite images one more time. The compound sat in a natural depression between 2 ridgelines, accessible only through a narrow valley that offered perfect opportunities for ambushes. Something about the whole setup felt wrong, but Rodriguez had learned long ago to trust his instincts while still following orders. "Ghost, what's your read on this?" Thompson asked through the radio, using Rodriguez's call sign. The young lieutenant had learned to value the veteran's judgment above all else. "Feels like a setup," Rodriguez replied quietly. "But we've got our orders. Stay sharp, and remember, we all go home together." The first sign of trouble came when they were still 3 miles from the target. Rodriguez's trained ear caught the sound before anyone else. The distinct whistle of an incoming rocket-propelled grenade. He had exactly 2 seconds to react. "RPG, take cover," he shouted, throwing himself out of the lead vehicle just as the explosion tore through the armor plating where he had been sitting moments before. The blast sent him tumbling across the rocky ground, his body armor absorbing most of the impact but leaving him dazed and bleeding from multiple cuts. The ambush had been planned with military precision. Taliban fighters emerged from carefully concealed positions on both sides of the valley, their weapons already trained on the convoy. Automatic gunfire erupted from at least a dozen positions, turning the narrow passage into a killing field. Rodriguez rolled behind a large boulder, his training taking over despite the ringing in his ears. He could see his team scrambling for cover as bullets pinged off rocks and metal all around them. Thompson was behind the burning wreckage of their vehicle, returning fire with his precision rifle. Mendez had found shelter in a small depression and was already setting up his machine gun. "Status report," Rodriguez called into his radio, trying to get a picture of the situation. "We've got at least 30 hostiles in elevated positions," Thompson reported between shots. "Martinez is hit in the leg, but he's still mobile. Johnson took shrapnel in the shoulder." Rodriguez quickly assessed their tactical situation. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and caught in the worst possible position. The enemy had the high ground and clear fields of fire down into the valley. Their extraction point was now 2 miles behind them through enemy-controlled territory. But Marcus Rodriguez hadn't earned his reputation by giving up when things looked impossible. He had built his legend by finding ways to win when everyone else saw only defeat. "Listen up," he said into his radio, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We're going to split into 2 teams. Thompson, take Mendez and half the squad, and work your way up the eastern ridge. I'll take the rest and create a distraction down here." "Negative, Ghost," Thompson replied immediately. "That's suicide. You'll be completely exposed down there." "That's an order, Lieutenant," Rodriguez said firmly. "Trust me on this one." What Rodriguez didn't tell his team was that he had spotted something during his quick reconnaissance. A narrow ravine that led up the western side of the valley. It would be dangerous, probably impossible. But it might give them the element of surprise they needed. As Thompson's team began their careful advance up the eastern slope, Rodriguez gathered the remaining 4 SEALs around him. "We're going up that ravine," he said, pointing to what looked like an impassable crack in the rock face. "It's going to be tight, and we'll be sitting ducks if they spot us. But it's our only shot at getting behind them." The climb was everything Rodriguez had expected, and worse. The ravine was barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, and loose rocks made every step treacherous. Twice, falling stones nearly gave away their position to the enemy fighters above. Rodriguez led the way. His hands and knees scraped raw from the rough rock, sweat mixing with blood from the cuts on his face. They were halfway up when disaster struck. A Taliban fighter manning a position directly above them happened to look down at exactly the wrong moment. Rodriguez saw the man's eyes widen in surprise just before he opened his mouth to shout a warning. Rodriguez's sidearm was in his hand before he consciously decided to draw it. The suppressed pistol coughed once, and the enemy fighter toppled backward without making a sound. But the damage was done. The man's body had fallen across a communications wire, and Rodriguez could hear excited voices from the positions above as the Taliban fighters realized their perimeter had been breached. "Move! Move! Move!" Rodriguez whispered urgently to his team. They had maybe 30 seconds before the entire enemy force would be looking for them. The final 20 feet of the climb were the longest of Rodriguez's life. Enemy fighters were shouting instructions to each other in Pashto, and he could hear boots scrambling across the rocks above them. Just as they reached the top of the ravine, Rodriguez heard the distinctive sound of a grenade pin being pulled. He didn't think, he just reacted. Throwing himself over the edge of the ravine, Rodriguez tackled the Taliban fighter who was preparing to drop the grenade into the narrow passage where his team was trapped. The 2 men rolled across the ground, fighting desperately for control of the explosive device. Rodriguez was older and more experienced, but his opponent was younger and desperate. They crashed into rocks and thorny bushes, each trying to gain an advantage. Rodriguez could feel the grenade's metal surface, still clutched in the enemy fighter's hand, and he knew he had only seconds before it would detonate. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, Rodriguez managed to twist the man's wrist sharply to the side. The grenade flew out of the Taliban fighter's grip, arcing through the air to land among a group of enemy positions 30 yards away. The explosion took out 3 fighters and scattered the rest. But Rodriguez's victory was short-lived. As he struggled to his feet, he felt the burn of a bullet tearing through his left shoulder. Then another through his thigh. The remaining Taliban fighters had spotted him and were concentrating their fire on his position. Rodriguez rolled behind a pile of loose rocks, his shoulder screaming in pain and his leg growing numb. He could hear his team members climbing out of the ravine behind him, finally in position to help, but he knew it might be too late. Blood was flowing freely from both wounds, and his vision was starting to blur around the edges. "Ghost is hit," he heard someone shout into the radio. "We need immediate medical evacuation." But even as his strength began to fade, Rodriguez continued to return fire at the enemy positions. This was what separated legends from ordinary soldiers: the refusal to quit, even when quitting would be the reasonable thing to do. Thompson's voice crackled through the radio from the eastern ridge. "We're in position, Ghost. Can you hold for 60 more seconds?" Rodriguez looked at the blood pooling around him and felt his hands beginning to shake from shock. 60 seconds might as well have been 60 hours, but he had never let his team down before, and he wasn't about to start now. "Copy that," he replied, surprised by how weak his own voice sounded. 60 seconds. What happened next would be talked about in military circles for years to come. Despite losing blood and fighting off shock, Rodriguez single-handedly held off a dozen Taliban fighters for exactly 61 seconds. He moved from cover to cover like a ghost, appearing just long enough to take down an enemy fighter before disappearing again. When Thompson's team finally opened fire from their elevated position, catching the Taliban fighters in a devastating crossfire, Rodriguez was still shooting. His movements were slower now, and his aim wasn't quite as precise as usual, but he was still fighting. The battle lasted another 15 minutes, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Taliban fighters, caught between two highly trained SEAL teams, began to retreat deeper into the mountains. Several were captured, including intelligence that would prove invaluable in future operations. As the gunfire finally died away, Rodriguez found himself lying behind the same pile of rocks where he had taken his first hit. His shoulder was on fire, his leg had gone completely numb, and he was having trouble focusing his eyes. But he was alive. And more importantly, his entire team was alive. Thompson appeared at his side, his young face creased with worry. "Stay with me, Ghost," he said, already working to apply pressure bandages to Rodriguez's wounds. "Medevac is inbound." Rodriguez tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace. "Did we get him?" he asked, referring to the Taliban commander who had been their original target. "Negative," Thompson replied. "Intel was bad. He was never here. The whole thing was a setup to draw us into an ambush." Rodriguez closed his eyes, feeling a familiar mixture of anger and disappointment. Good men had been wounded for nothing. Resources had been wasted chasing a ghost. It was the kind of mission outcome that ate at a professional soldier's soul. "But we got something better," Thompson continued. "Mendez found a laptop with communications between several high-value targets. Intelligence thinks it might lead us to bigger fish." The sound of helicopter rotors was growing louder now, and Rodriguez could see the dust cloud approaching from the south. The medevac team would stabilize him for the flight to the forward surgical hospital, where real doctors would patch him up enough to send him home for proper treatment. As the medical team worked over him, Rodriguez caught glimpses of his squad gathering around. These men had followed him into impossible situations for years, trusting his judgment even when it seemed insane. They had earned their reputation as an elite unit by taking on missions that other teams couldn't handle. "Listen to me," Rodriguez said, his voice barely audible over the helicopter noise. "This isn't over. Someone set us up, and they knew exactly how we operate. Watch your backs until we figure out who." Thompson nodded grimly. "We'll handle it, Ghost. You just focus on getting better." As the helicopter lifted off, carrying Rodriguez away from the battlefield, he had no way of knowing that this mission would not be his last. The intelligence they had captured would indeed lead to bigger targets, and when that happened, Command would want their most experienced operator back in the field. The legend of the Ghost was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. The fluorescent lights of the military hospital in Germany seemed harsh after weeks of desert sun, but Marcus Rodriguez had grown accustomed to their sterile brightness during his month-long recovery. His shoulder had healed faster than expected, though it still ached when the weather changed. His leg was another story. The bullet had nicked an artery, and the doctors said he was lucky to be walking at all. Rodriguez spent his days in physical therapy, pushing his body back to the standards expected of a Navy SEAL. The therapists kept telling him to take it easy, that he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. They didn't understand that for men like Rodriguez, being ready wasn't about proving anything. It was about being prepared when his brothers needed him. The call came on a Tuesday morning, while Rodriguez was finishing his daily workout routine. Colonel Patricia Hayes, his commanding officer, appeared on the secure video screen looking more serious than he had ever seen her. "Marcus, how are you feeling?" she asked, though her tone suggested this wasn't a social call. "Ready for duty, ma'am," Rodriguez replied automatically, though he knew his medical clearance was still weeks away. "Good, because we need you," Hayes said without preamble. "Remember that laptop Mendez recovered during your last mission? It's given us the location of someone we've been hunting for 3 years." Rodriguez felt his pulse quicken. There were only a handful of targets that could put that kind of urgency in Hayes's voice. "Ahmed Hassan," Hayes continued, confirming Rodriguez's suspicions. "The intelligence indicates he's planning something big. Multiple simultaneous attacks across 3 countries. We have a narrow window to stop him." Ahmed Hassan was a name that every counterterrorism operative knew by heart. The former Iraqi military officer had disappeared during the chaos following the invasion and re-emerged 2 years later as one of the most dangerous terrorist organizers in the Middle East. He was responsible for attacks that had killed hundreds of civilians and dozens of coalition forces. "What's the timeline?" Rodriguez asked, already knowing he wouldn't like the answer. Hassan is meeting with his cell leaders in 72 hours. After that, he disappears again. Probably for months. This is our shot, Marcus. Maybe our only shot. Rodriguez understood the implications. A mission this important wouldn't wait for his full medical clearance. They needed him now, ready or not. Where? He asked. Syria, a compound outside Aleppo. It's heavily fortified, and Hassan never stays in one place for more than a few hours. We'll have maybe a 30-minute window. Rodriguez studied the satellite images Hayes transmitted to his tablet. The compound looked like a fortress, surrounded by high walls and multiple defensive positions. The approach routes were limited, and every one of them was covered by overlapping fields of fire. What's the team composition? He asked. Your old squad. Plus 2 additional operators. Thompson is mission commander. He's done excellent work while you've been recovering. You'll be going in as an advisor. Rodriguez felt a mixture of pride and concern. Thompson was a natural leader. But he was still young. This kind of high-stakes operation could make or break a commander's career. I want to talk to Thompson before we deploy, Rodriguez said. He's already en route to Germany to brief you. You'll have 6 hours together before you both fly to the staging area. The secure connection ended, leaving Rodriguez alone with his thoughts and the satellite images. He had been in situations like this dozens of times before. But something about this mission felt different. Maybe it was the rushed timeline. Or maybe it was the nagging feeling that someone had been feeding information to their enemies. Thompson arrived that afternoon, looking older than his 26 years. The responsibility of command had aged him, and Rodriguez could see the weight of recent decisions in the young officer's eyes. How are the men? Rodriguez asked, as they settled into a secure briefing room. Ready, Thompson replied without hesitation. Martinez is back from medical leave, and we've got 2 new operators who come highly recommended. The team is tight. What's your read on the intelligence? Thompson hesitated, and Rodriguez caught the brief moment of uncertainty. It's solid, Thompson said finally. Multiple sources confirm Hassan's presence at the compound. The timing checks out with other intelligence we've gathered. But, Rodriguez prompted, sensing there was more. But it feels too clean, Thompson admitted. Everything lines up perfectly. The source, the timing, the target's travel patterns. After what happened on our last mission, you think it's another setup, Rodriguez finished. I think we need to be prepared for that possibility. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. Thompson was learning to trust his instincts, which would make him a better commander in the long run. They spent the next 4 hours going over every detail of the mission plan. The compound was located in a valley similar to where they had been ambushed. But this time, they would be approaching from multiple directions. 2 helicopter-borne teams would fast rope onto the compound itself, while a ground team secured the perimeter and escape routes. Rodriguez would be with Thompson's helicopter team, despite his recent injuries. The official reasoning was that his experience with Hassan's network made him invaluable for target identification. The real reason was that Thompson wanted Rodriguez's tactical expertise available during the most critical phase of the mission. What's your gut telling you about the approach? Rodriguez asked as they studied the aerial photographs. The eastern wall is the weakest point, Thompson replied. But it's also the most obvious choice. If I were setting an ambush, that's where I'd expect them to come from. So where would you come from? Thompson pointed to the northern side of the compound. Here. It's more heavily defended, but they won't expect a direct assault on their strongest position. Rodriguez smiled. Thompson was thinking like a veteran now, understanding that sometimes the most dangerous approach was actually the safest. The flight to the staging area took 8 hours, giving Rodriguez time to study the most recent intelligence reports. Hassan had been unusually active in recent weeks, moving between safe houses and meeting with operatives who normally avoided any contact with him. The pattern suggested something major was indeed being planned. What concerned Rodriguez more were the gaps in the intelligence. Too many details about Hassan's security arrangements were missing, and several of the sources providing information were relatively new to their network. In his experience, that combination usually meant trouble. The forward operating base was a study in controlled chaos when they arrived. Helicopters were being prepped for multiple missions, and teams of specialists were loading equipment and running final checks on their gear. Rodriguez felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with preparing for combat. "Ghost!" The voice belonged to Petty Officer Carlos Mendez, who appeared at Rodriguez's side with a huge grin. "Good to see you back, man. How's the leg?" "Good enough," Rodriguez replied, genuinely happy to see his old teammate. "How are you feeling about this mission?" Mendez's expression grew more serious. "Honestly, something doesn't feel right. We've been getting too much good intelligence lately. In my experience, when everything goes your way, it's usually because someone wants it to." Rodriguez found himself nodding in agreement. Mendez had survived as an explosives expert by being paranoid about everything, and his instincts were usually reliable. The final briefing took place in a secure tent surrounded by armed guards. The intelligence officer presenting the information was someone Rodriguez didn't recognize, which was unusual for a mission of this importance. "Hassan is confirmed to be at the target location as of 1800 hours local time," the officer announced. "Surveillance indicates he'll remain there for the coordination meeting, which is scheduled to last approximately 4 hours. "What's the source of this surveillance?" Thompson asked. "Classified," the officer replied quickly. "Multiple assets confirm the target's presence." Rodriguez caught Thompson's eye and saw his own concerns reflected there. Good intelligence officers didn't usually hide their sources from the operators who would be risking their lives based on that information. After the briefing, Rodriguez pulled Thompson aside. "I don't like this," he said quietly. "Too many unknowns. And that intelligence officer was hiding something." "I know," Thompson replied. "But we have our orders. Hassan is too important to let slip away." "Then we modify the plan," Rodriguez said. "If this is a setup, we need to be ready for it." They spent the next 2 hours revising their approach. Instead of hitting the compound simultaneously from 2 directions, they would stage their attack in phases. Thompson's team would go in first while Rodriguez's team remained in reserve, ready to provide support or extract the primary team if things went wrong. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it gave them more flexibility if the situation deteriorated rapidly. The helicopter ride to the target took 45 minutes, flying low and fast through mountain valleys to avoid enemy radar. Rodriguez found himself thinking about all the missions he had flown over the years, all the times he had trusted his life to pilots he barely knew, and intelligence that might or might not be accurate. 2 minutes to target, the pilot announced over the intercom. Rodriguez checked his equipment one final time and looked around at his teammates. These men had followed him through impossible situations before, and he knew they would do whatever was necessary to complete the mission and bring everyone home safely. "Remember," Thompson said over the radio, "we go in fast and hard, secure Hassan, and get out. If this is a trap, we don't give them time to spring it properly." The compound appeared below them exactly as it had in the satellite images. High walls surrounded several buildings, with guard towers at each corner. Rodriguez could see movement in the courtyard, people running for cover as the helicopters approached. "Fast rope, fast rope, fast rope," the crew chief shouted. Rodriguez slid down the rope despite the protests from his still healing leg. He hit the ground running, his rifle already up and scanning for targets. The courtyard was larger than it had appeared in the photos, with more cover than their intelligence had indicated. The first sign that something was wrong came when they breached the main building. Instead of finding a meeting in progress, they discovered a nearly empty structure with only 2 low-level guards, who surrendered immediately. "Building secure," Thompson reported. "No sign of Hassan." Rodriguez felt his heart sink. They had walked into another trap, just like the last time. The only question now was when the hammer would fall. The answer came 60 seconds later in the form of rocket-propelled grenades fired from concealed positions around the compound. The explosions shattered the walls around them and filled the air with deadly fragments of stone and metal. "Ambush! Ambush! Ambush!" Thompson shouted into his radio. "All teams take cover." Rodriguez dove behind a concrete barrier as automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple directions. The enemy had turned the compound into a kill box, with overlapping fields of fire that made movement nearly impossible. But Rodriguez hadn't survived this long by giving up when the odds turned against him. As bullets whined overhead, he was already planning their counterattack. The concrete barrier that saved Rodriguez's life was already crumbling under the relentless gunfire. Chunks of debris rained down on him as enemy rounds chewed through the supposedly solid cover. He could hear Thompson shouting orders to the team, trying to organize a defensive position in what had become a death trap. "Ghost, we need to move." Thompson's voice crackled through the radio. "This position is going to be overrun in minutes." Rodriguez peered around the edge of his cover and immediately understood how desperate their situation had become. The enemy hadn't just prepared an ambush. They had turned the entire compound into a carefully designed killing field. Machine gun nests were positioned to cover every possible escape route, and the walls that had looked like protection from above were actually barriers preventing them from breaking out. "How many hostiles?" Rodriguez asked, though he was already counting muzzle flashes and calculating angles of fire. "At least 40, maybe more," came Mendez's voice from somewhere across the courtyard. "They've got us pinned down from 3 sides." Rodriguez's tactical mind was working furiously, processing the layout of the compound and the positions of his team members. They had walked into a perfect trap. But every trap had a weakness, if you could find it quickly enough. The weakness here was that the enemy had focused all their firepower on keeping the SEALs trapped inside the compound. They hadn't expected anyone to try breaking further in toward the center of their position. "Thompson, listen to me," Rodriguez said into his radio, keeping his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "There's a building in the center of the compound that they're not defending. If we can reach it, we can use it as a base to break out." "That's suicide, Ghost," Thompson replied immediately. "We'd have to cross 50 yards of open ground under direct fire. I be hears of C, not if someone creates a distraction," Rodriguez said quietly. There was a moment of silence on the radio, and Rodriguez knew that Thompson understood exactly what he was suggesting. Someone would have to draw the enemy's fire long enough for the rest of the team to move. It was a one-way mission for whoever volunteered. "Negative," Thompson said firmly. But Rodriguez had already made his decision. He had been leading men into dangerous situations for 15 years, and he had never asked anyone to take risks that he wouldn't take himself. This mission was no different. "Jimmy, you're a good officer," Rodriguez said, using Thompson's first name for the first time. "Take care of the team." Before Thompson could respond, Rodriguez was moving. He burst from behind his cover at a full sprint, firing his rifle in controlled bursts at the nearest enemy positions. Immediately, every hostile fighter in the compound shifted their attention to him. The effect was exactly what Rodriguez had hoped for. The concentrated enemy fire followed him as he sprinted across the courtyard, leaving momentary gaps in their coverage of his teammates' positions. He could hear Thompson shouting orders, and the distinctive sound of his team members moving to better positions. Rodriguez made it halfway to the central building before the first bullet found him. It caught him in the right side, spinning him around and sending him tumbling behind a low wall. Pain shot through his torso, but he could still move his arms and legs. Not fatal, but not good either. "Ghost is hit," he heard someone shout over the radio. "Stay down," Thompson ordered. "We're coming to get you." "Negative," Rodriguez gasped into his radio. "Complete the mission. Hassan's location is in that building." It was a lie, but Rodriguez knew his team well enough to understand what would motivate them. They would never abandon a wounded teammate, but they might risk everything for a chance to complete their mission. Rodriguez forced himself to keep moving, crawling along the base of the wall toward the central building. Every few seconds, he would pop up and fire a few rounds to keep the enemy's attention focused on him. He could feel blood soaking through his uniform, but adrenaline was keeping the worst of the pain at bay. The second bullet hit him as he was reloading his rifle. This one caught him in the left shoulder, nearly the same spot where he had been wounded during the previous mission. The impact slammed him against the wall and sent his rifle spinning away across the ground. Rodriguez drew his sidearm with his good hand and continued firing. He had maybe 20 rounds left, and there were still dozens of enemy fighters shooting at him from multiple directions. The mathematics of the situation were simple and brutal. "Thompson, status report," he said into his radio, surprised by how weak his voice sounded. "We've reached the building," Thompson replied. "But Ghost, there's no intelligence here. The whole place is empty except for some old equipment. Rodriguez closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a familiar mixture of anger and disappointment. They had been played again, led into another trap by someone who knew exactly how they operated. Good men were going to die for nothing. The third bullet shattered his left leg just below the knee. Rodriguez fell heavily to the ground, his vision blurring from pain and shock. He could feel his strength ebbing away, but he still had his sidearm and a few rounds of ammunition left. "All teams, this is Thompson," came the lieutenant's voice over the radio. "We're extracting. Ghost, can you make it to the eastern wall?" Rodriguez looked at his shattered leg and felt the warm wetness spreading across his chest from his other wounds. He could barely sit up, let alone walk to an extraction point. "Negative," he replied quietly. "I'm staying here to cover your withdrawal." "Like hell you are," Thompson shot back. "Mendez, Martinez, we're going back for him." "That's an order," Rodriguez said with as much authority as he could muster. "Get the team out of here." Rodriguez knew that Thompson would follow that order, even though it would tear him apart to do so. That was what separated good officers from great ones: the ability to make impossible decisions when lives were on the line. The enemy fighters were closing in now, moving carefully from cover to cover as they advanced on Rodriguez's position. He counted at least 8 men approaching from different angles, their weapons trained on the spot where he lay bleeding. Rodriguez checked his pistol one more time. 6 rounds left, not enough to stop all of them, but maybe enough to buy his team a few more precious seconds to escape. As the first enemy fighter rounded the corner of the wall, Rodriguez was ready for him. His pistol barked once, and the man dropped. 5 rounds left. The second fighter was more cautious, exposing only the barrel of his rifle as he tried to get an angle on Rodriguez's position. Rodriguez waited patiently, controlling his breathing despite the pain, until the man made the mistake of showing his shoulder. Another shot, another enemy down. 4 rounds left. Rodriguez could hear the sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. The extraction was coming, but they would have to land outside the compound walls and wait for his team to reach them. Every second he could delay the enemy advance increased the chances that his men would make it out alive. The third fighter tried to flank him from the right, moving quickly between pieces of rubble. Rodriguez tracked him with his pistol sight and fired when the man was halfway between cover points. The bullet caught him center mass, and he fell without making a sound. 3 rounds left. Rodriguez was starting to feel lightheaded from blood loss, and his hands were beginning to shake. He knew he didn't have much time left, but he also knew that his team was still fighting their way to the extraction point. 2 more fighters appeared simultaneously, one from each side of his position. Rodriguez had to choose which one to engage first, knowing that the other would have a free shot at him. He chose the fighter on his left, putting him down with a single round to the chest. 2 rounds left. The fighter on his right opened fire immediately, his bullets chewing into the wall inches from Rodriguez's head. Rodriguez rolled painfully to the side and returned fire, but his shot went wide. The enemy fighter was already moving to a better position. 1 round left. Rodriguez lay still, pretending to be more badly wounded than he actually was. The remaining fighters would come to check on him, and when they did, he would take as many of them with him as possible. The sound of approaching boots on gravel told him that his deception was working. Rodriguez gripped a fragmentation grenade with his free hand, keeping the pistol ready in case he needed it first. 3 fighters appeared around the edge of the wall, their weapons lowered slightly as they approached what they thought was a dying man. Rodriguez let them get closer, waiting until all 3 were within the lethal radius of his grenade. "For my brothers," Rodriguez whispered, and pulled the pin. The explosion was enormous in the confined space, taking out all 3 enemy fighters and bringing down a section of the compound wall. Rodriguez felt the concussion wave wash over him, adding to his already serious injuries. But he was still alive, and more importantly, he could still hear gunfire from other parts of the compound. The remaining enemy fighters were regrouping, probably preparing for a final assault on his position. Rodriguez's radio crackled to life. "Ghost, this is Thompson. We're at the extraction point, but we're not leaving without you. Get out of here," Rodriguez replied, though he was no longer sure if his radio was even working. "That's an order." "Closed. Closed. Closed-ar. Closed. Closed-ar cask. Closed-ar cascar." Clostar Kaskar. Clostar Kaskar 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 Kaskar. Rodriguez could hear vehicles approaching from outside the compound. Either reinforcements for the enemy, or possibly a ground extraction team. He hoped it was the latter, but he was in no condition to find out. As consciousness began to fade, Rodriguez thought about all the missions he had completed over the years, all the men he had served with, and all the times they had faced impossible odds together. This was how it was supposed to end for men like him. Not in a hospital bed years from now, but in combat, buying time for his brothers to make it home safely. The last thing Rodriguez remembered was the sound of American voices shouting his call sign. Someone had come back for him, despite his orders. That was exactly what he would have done in their position. When Rodriguez woke up, he was in a military hospital in Germany, connected to more machines than he could count. Thompson was sitting in a chair beside his bed, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "How long?" Rodriguez asked, his voice barely a whisper. 4 days, Thompson replied. "The doctors weren't sure you were going to make it." "The team? Everyone made it out. Martinez took some shrapnel, but he'll be fine. We lost you for 6 minutes during extraction, but Mendez refused to give up on the CPR." Rodriguez closed his eyes, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief. His men were safe. The mission had failed, but his men were safe. In the end, that was all that really mattered. "There's something else," Thompson said quietly. "Command thinks they've identified the source of the intelligence leaks. Someone in the Syrian government has been feeding our enemies information about our operations." Rodriguez nodded slowly. It explained everything. The perfect ambushes. The accurate intelligence that always seemed to lead them into traps. Someone had been playing a long game, using their own successes against them. "What's next?" Rodriguez asked. Thompson was quiet for a long moment. "You're being recommended for the Medal of Honor," he said finally. "What you did back there. The whole team would be dead if not for your actions." Rodriguez felt uncomfortable with the praise. In his mind, he had simply done what any leader would do, put his men's lives ahead of his own. "And the mission against Hassan?" "Postponed indefinitely," Thompson replied. "But we'll get him eventually. Men like him always make mistakes." Rodriguez spent the next 3 months recovering from his wounds. His leg would never be the same, and his shoulder would always ache in cold weather. The doctors said he would probably never be cleared for active combat duty again. But Rodriguez had already decided that his fighting days were over. He had spent 15 years leading men into impossible situations, and he had been lucky enough to bring most of them home. It was time to step aside and let younger men like Thompson take over the fight. On the day he was discharged from the hospital, Rodriguez was visited by a delegation from the Pentagon. They presented him with the Medal of Honor in a small, private ceremony, attended only by his immediate team members. As Thompson pinned the medal to Rodriguez's dress uniform, the young officer spoke quietly enough that only Rodriguez could hear him. "You taught us that legends aren't born," Thompson said. "They're forged by the choices they make when everything is on the line." Rodriguez looked around at the faces of his teammates, men who had followed him through hell and back, men who would carry on the fight long after he was gone. These were the real heroes, the ones who would continue putting their lives on the line to keep others safe. The legend of the Ghost would live on in the stories these men told, in the lessons they passed on to the next generation of warriors. Rodriguez had become something more than just a soldier. He had become a symbol of what it meant to refuse to quit, even when quitting would be the reasonable thing to do. Years later, when young SEALs asked about the man they called the Ghost, their instructors would tell them about Marcus Rodriguez, the legend who had been injured, buried, and bloodied, but who had refused to die when his brothers needed him most. That was the true measure of a legend. Not the medals or the commendations, but the willingness to sacrifice everything for the men standing beside you. Rodriguez had done that, and in doing so, he had earned his place in the brotherhood of warriors who understood that some things were worth dying for. But more importantly, he had lived to see his men make it home safely. In the end, that was the only reward that really mattered.